No, I can't stop now. It seems to me in my condition that I'm no longer merely asserting my brother's position as a poet. I feel I'm removing, at least for a moment, for a minute or two, all the detonators from all the bombs in this bloody world, a very tiny, purely temporary public courtesy, no doubt but mine own. It's generally agreed that Chinese and Japanese poets like simple subjects best, and I'd feel more oafish than usual if I tried to refute that. But simple happens to be a word I personally hate like poison, since where I come from anyway, it's customarily applied to the unconscionably brief, the time-saving in general, the trivial, the bald, and the abridged. My personal phobias aside, I don't really believe there is a word in any language, thank God, to describe the Chinese or Japanese poet's choice of material. I wonder who can find a word for this kind of thing. A proud, pompous cabinet member, walking in his courtyard and reliving a particularly devastating speech he made that morning in the emperor's presence, steps with regret on a pen and ink sketch someone has lost or discarded. Woe is me, there's a prose writer in our midst. I have to use italics where the Oriental poet wouldn't. The great Issa will joyfully advise us that there's a fat-faced peony in the garden. No more, no less, whether we go to see his fat-faced peony for ourselves is another matter, unlike certain prose writers and Western poetasters, whom I'm in no position to name off. He doesn't police us. The very mention of Issa's name convinces me that the true poet has no choice of material. The material plainly chooses him, not he it. A fat-faced peony will not show itself to anyone but Issa. Not to Busan, not to Shiki, not even to Basho. With certain prosaic modifications, the same rule holds for the proud and pompous cabinet member. He will not dare to step with divinely human regret on a piece of sketch paper till the great commoner, bastard, and poet Lao Tzu has arrived on the scene to watch. The miracle of Chinese and Japanese verse is that one pure poet's voice is absolutely the same as another's and at once absolutely distinctive and different. Tang Li divulges when he is 93 and is praised to his face for his wisdom and charity, that his piles are killing him. For another, a last example, Ko Huang observes, with tears coursing down his face, that his late master had extremely bad table manners. There is a risk always of being a trifle too beastly to the West. A line exists in Kafka's diaries, one of many of his really, that could easily usher in the Chinese New Year. Quote, "The young girl who only because she was walking arm in arm with her sweetheart looked quietly around," end of quote. As for my brother Seymour, my brother Seymour, for this Semitic Celtic Oriental I need a spanking new paragraph. Unofficially, Seymour wrote and taught Chinese and Japanese poetry all the 31 years he stopped with us, but I'd say that he made a formal beginning at composing it one morning when he was 11, in the first floor reading room of a public library on Upper Broadway near our house. It was a Saturday, no school, nothing more pressing ahead of us than lunch, and we were having a fine time idly swimming around or treading water between the stacks, occasionally doing a little serious fishing for new authors. When he suddenly signaled to me to come over and see what he had, he'd caught himself a whole mess of translated verses by Pang, the wonder of the 11th century. But fishing, as we know, in libraries or anywhere else, is a tricky business with never a certainty of who's going to catch whom. The hazards of fishing in general were themselves a favorite subject of Seymour's. Our younger brother Walt was a great bent pen fisherman as a fall boy. Our younger brother Walt was a great bent pen fisherman as a small boy, and for his 9th or 10th birthday, he received a poem from Seymour. One of the major delights of his life, I believe, about a little rich boy who catches a Lafayette in the Hudson River, experiences a fierce pain in his own lower lip on reeling him in, then dismisses the matter from his mind only to discover when he is home and the still alive fish has been given the run of the bathtub that he, the fish, is wearing a blue serge cap with the same school insignia over the peak as the boy's own. The boy finds his own name tape. The boy finds his own name tape sewn inside the tiny wet cap. Permanently, from that morning on, Seymour was hooked. By the time he was 14, one or two of us in the family were fairly regularly going through his jackets and windbreakers for anything good he might have jotted down during a slow gym period or a long wait at the dentist's. A day has passed since this last sentence, and in the interim, I've put through a long-distance call from my place of business to my sister Boo Boo in Tuckahoe to ask her if there's any poem from Seymour's very early boyhood that she'd especially like to go into this account. She said she'd call me back. Her choice turned out to be not nearly so apposite to my present purposes as I'd like, and therefore a trifle irritating, but I think I'll get over it. The one she picked, I happen to know, was written when the poet was 8. Quote, John Keats. John Keats. John, please put your scarf on. End of quote. When he was 22, he had one special, not thin, sheaf of poems that looked very, very good to me, and I, who have never written a line longhand in my life without instantly visualizing it in 11-point type, rather fractiously urged him to submit them for publication somewhere. No, he didn't think he could do that. Not yet, maybe never. They were too un-Western, too lotusy. He said he felt that they were faintly affronting. He hadn't quite made up his mind where the affronting came in, but he felt at times that the poems read as though they'd been written by an ingrate of sorts. Someone who was turning his back, in effect at least, on his own environment and the people in it who were close to him. He said he ate his food out of our big refrigerators, drove our 8-cylinder American cars, unhesitatingly used our medicines when he was sick, and relied on the U.S. Army to protect his parents and sisters from Hitler's Germany, and nothing, not one single thing in all his poems reflected these realities. Something was terribly wrong. He said that so often after he'd finished a poem, he thought of Miss Overman. It should be said that Miss Overman had been the librarian in the first public library branch in New York we regularly used when we were children. He said he felt he owed Miss Overman a painstaking, sustained search for a form of poetry that was in accord with his own peculiar standards and yet not wholly incompatible, even at first sight, with Miss Overman's tastes. When he got through saying that, I pointed out to him calmly, patiently, that is, of course, at the bloody top of my voice, what I thought were Miss Overman's shortcomings as a judge or even a reader of poetry. He then reminded me that on his first day in the public library, alone, age 6, Miss Overman, wanting or not as a judge of poetry, had opened a book to a plate of Leonardo's Catapult and placed it brightly before him, and that it was no joy to him to finish writing a poem and know that Miss Overman would have trouble turning to it with pleasure or involvement, coming, as she probably would come, fresh from her beloved Mr. Browning or her equally dear and no less explicit Mr. Wordsworth. The argument, my argument, his discussion ended there. You can't argue with someone who believes or just passionately suspects that the poet's function is not to write what he must write, but rather to write what he would write if his life depended on his taking responsibility for writing what he must in a style designed to shut out as few of his old librarians as humanly possible. For the faithful, the patient, the hermetically pure, all the important things in this world, not life and death perhaps, which are merely words, but the important things, work out rather beautifully. Before his finish, Seymour had over 3 years of what must have been the profoundest satisfaction that a veteran craftsman is permitted to feel. He found for himself a form of versification that was right for him, that met his most long-standing demands of poetry in general, and that I believe, had she still been alive, Miss Overman herself would very likely have thought striking, perhaps even comely, to look upon, and certainly, quote, involving, end of quote, provided she gave her attention to it as unfrugally as she gave it to her old swains, Browning and Wordsworth. What he found for himself, worked out for himself, is very difficult to describe. The normal and only rational thing to do at this point would be to plank down 1, 2, or all 184 of the poems for the reader to see for himself. I can't do it. Not even sure that I have a right to discuss the matter. I'm permitted to sit on the poems, edit them, look after them, and eventually pick out a hardcover publisher for them. But on extremely personal grounds, I've been forbidden by the poet's widow, who legally owns them, to quote any portion of them here. It may help to start with to say that Seymour probably loved the classical Japanese 3-line, 17-syllable haiku as he loved no other form of poetry, and that he himself wrote, bled, haiku, almost always in English, but sometimes, I hope I'm duly reluctant to bring in Japanese, German, or Italian. It could be said, and most likely will be, that a late period poem of Seymour's looks substantially like an English translation of a sort of double haiku, if such a thing existed, and I don't think I'd quibble over that. But I tend to sicken at the strong probability that some tired but indefatigably waggish English department member in 1970, not impossibly myself, God help me, will get off a good one about a poem of Seymour's being to the haiku what a double martini is to the usual martini. And the fact that it isn't true won't necessarily stop a pedant if he feels that the class is properly warmed up and ready. Anyway, while I'm able, I'm going to say this rather slowly and carefully. A late poem of Seymour's is a 6-line verse of no certain accent, but usually more iambic than not, that, partly out of affection for dead Japanese masters and partly from his own natural bent as a poet for working inside attractive restricted areas, he has deliberately held down to 34 syllables, or twice the number of the classical haiku. Apart from that, nothing in any of the 184 poems currently under my roof is much like anything except Seymour himself. To say the least, the acoustics even are as singular as Seymour. That is, each of the poems is as unsonorous, as quiet as he believed a poem should be, but there are intermittent short blasts of euphony, for want of a less atrocious word for it, which have the effect on me personally of someone, surely no one completely sober, opening my door, blowing 3 or 4 or 5 unquestionably sweet and expert notes on a cornet into the room, then disappearing. I've never known a poet to give the impression of playing a cornet in the middle of a poem before, let alone playing one beautifully. And I'd just as soon say next to nothing about it. In fact, nothing. Within this 6-line structure and these very odd harmonics, Seymour does with a poem, I think, exactly what he was meant to do with one. By far the majority of the 184 poems are immeasurably not light but high-hearted, and can be read by anyone, anywhere, even aloud in rather progressive orphanages on stormy nights. But I wouldn't unreservedly recommend the last 30 or 35 poems to any living soul who hasn't died at least twice in his lifetime, preferably slowly. My own favorites, if I have any, and I most assuredly do, are the 2 final poems in the collection. I don't think I'll be stepping on anybody's toes if I very simply say what they are about. The next to last poem is about a young married woman and mother who is plainly having what it refers to here in my old marriage manual as an extramarital love affair. Seymour doesn't describe her, but she comes into the poem just when that cornet of him is doing something extraordinarily effective, and I see her as a terribly pretty girl, moderately intelligent, immoderately unhappy, and not unlikely living a block or 2 away from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She comes home very late one night from a tryst, in my mind bleary and lipstick smeared, to find a balloon on her bedspread. Someone has simply left it there. The poet doesn't say, but it can't be anything but a large inflated toy balloon, probably green like Central Park in spring. The other poem, the last one in the collection, is about a young suburban widower who sits down on his patch of lawn one night, implicitly in his pajamas and robe, to look at the full moon. A bored white cat, clearly a member of his household and almost surely a former kingpin of his household, comes up to him and rolls over, and he lets her bite his left hand as he looks at the moon. This final poem, in fact, could well be of extra interest to my general reader on two quite special counts. I'd like very much to discuss them. As suits most poetry and emphatically befits any poetry with a marked Chinese or Japanese, quote, influence, end of quote, Seymour's verses are all as bare as possible and invariably ungarnished. However, on a weekend visit up here some 6 months ago, my younger sister, Franny, while accidentally rifling my desk drawers, came across this widower poem I've just finished, criminally plotting out. It had been detached from the main body of the collection for retyping. For reasons not strictly pertinent at the moment, she had never seen the poem before, and so naturally she read it on the spot. Later, in talking to me about the poem, she said she wondered why Seymour had said it was the left hand that the young widower let the white cat bite. That bothered her. She said it sounded more like me than like Seymour, that left business. Apart, of course, from the slanderous reflection on my ever-increasing professional passion for detail, I think she meant that the adjective struck her as obtrusive, over-explicit, unpoetic. I argued her down, and I'm prepared, frankly, to argue you down, too, if necessary. I'm certain in my own mind that Seymour thought it vital to suggest that it was the left, the second best hand, the young widower let the white cat press her needle-sharp teeth into, thereby leaving the right hand free for breast or forehead smiting, an analysis that may seem to many readers very, very tiresome indeed. And maybe so, but I know how my brother felt about human hands. Besides, there is another exceedingly considerable aspect of the matter. It may seem a little tasteless to go into it at any length, rather like insisting on reading the entire script of, quote, A.B.'s Irish Rose, end of quote, to a perfect stranger over the phone. But Seymour was a half Jew. And while I can't speak up with the great Kafka's absolute authority on this theme, it's my very sober guess, at 40, that any thinking man with a muchness of Semitic blood in his veins either lives or has lived on oddly intimate, almost mutually knowledgeable terms with his hands. And though he may go along for years and years figuratively or literally keeping them in his pockets, not always, I'm afraid, altogether unlike two pushy old friends or relatives he'd prefer not to bring to the party, he will, I think, use them, break them out very readily in a crisis, often do something drastic with them in a crisis, such as mentioning, unpoetically, in the middle of a poem that it was the left hand the cat bit, and poetry, surely, is a crisis, perhaps the only actionable one we can call our own. I apologize for that verbiage. Unfortunately, there's probably more. My second reason for thinking that the particular poem may be of extra and, I hope, real interest to my general reader is the queer personal force that has gone into it. I've never seen anything quite like it in print, and I might injudiciously mention, from early childhood till I was well past 30, I seldom read fewer than 200,000 words a day, and often closer to 4. Wow, it's a lot of reading, I think. At 40, admittedly, I rarely feel even peckish, and when I'm not required to inspect English compositions, Belonging either to young ladies or to myself, I customarily read very little except harsh postcards from relatives, seed catalogs, bird watchers' bulletins of one sort or another, and poignant get-well-soon notes from old readers of mine who have somewhere picked up the bogus information that I spend 6 months of the year in a Buddhist monastery and the other 6 in a mental institution.